Good morning and good afternoon to those who are joining in. It's delighted to see everybody. I have to move to my basement. We were having some technical problems. Sorry for the funny screen appearance here. But I'm Jeff Abramson. I'm manage the Forum on the Arms Trade. I'm also a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association, which provides a home for the Forum on the Arms Trade. The Forum on the Arms Trade is a network of civil society experts who work on the humanitarian, economic, and other implications of arms trade, security systems, and weapons use. We're really delighted you could join us. This is the third in our series of events, really looking at the Biden administration and Congress. The first one was our annual conference, which occurred in January, just before the Biden administration took office. And Rachel Stahl, one of our presenters today, helped moderate the session, looking at advice for the administration. And we also were lucky to have a number of members of Congress join in, Ted Lieu and Ilhan Omar, to provide a congressional perspective. In the middle of February, we did another event really looking at the Middle East and Yemen, where we were delighted to have comments from Ro Khanna, as well as from Radi al-Muqtaqawal, who is one of our Yemeni experts, as well as other humanitarian and arms trade experts who joined in. And this is really our third event, looking at what's happened in the first 100 days around arms trade and from the Biden administration, as well as from Congress. So we're really looking to have a great event. Just to give you a feel for what we're going to do, we're going to break this up into three pieces. The first piece will be looking specifically at the Biden administration, and then we'll turn and look at Congress, and then we'll really open up for Q&A. But please do feel free to use the Q&A. I will go back in and enable the chat. You will also be able to chat, but that chat is really only for participants, not for the panelists. The panelists will be moderating the Q&A. I think that's all in terms of logistics I wanted to talk about. I want to now turn us over to our first panel, which includes Rachel Stahl and Frank Slidgper, who are going to talk about what's happened with the Biden administration. Rachel Stahl is Vice President of the Stimson Center and Director of the Conventional Defense Program. Rachel is also one of the experts who helped start the forum many years ago and has been doing this work for quite a while and super busy lately, including just last week when she launched a new report looking at drone policy and use of lethal force. Frank Slidgper is the leader of the arms trade project at PAX, which is based in the Netherlands. Frank's been also working on these issues since the 90s. Frank can help provide some perspective from Europe and other places around the world who are viewing what the United States is doing. Many of you probably know that the European community is super active on these issues, and Frank can provide some insights there. With that, I'd like to invite Frank and Rachel to turn on their screens. And I'm going to turn off my screen and try to move to a little bit better setting. But Rachel, if you could go first and give us a sense of what you're seeing in the Biden administration, and then we'll turn to Frank.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me. We've had some technical problems this morning, so hopefully I'm not just speaking to myself. But I'm really happy to be here this morning. I think, you know, it's always a good time to use anniversaries as an opportunity to look back and see where we've come and where we still have to go. So this first 100 days provides us an opportunity to reassess and reevaluate where the Biden administration is on the conventional arms trade issues that many of us care so deeply about. And I think it's particularly important because as the world's largest exporter, the United States comes with a responsibility to not only ensure that it engages in the global arms trade conscientiously and humanely, but also to act as a leading actor on the international stage to advance responsible transfer laws and policies and to mitigate harm. And what's great is the Biden administration has said that's exactly what they want to do. But I would say that the Biden administration's early record in upholding and advancing these guiding principles has really been marked by a bit of inaction, a little bit of inertia, a little bit of confusion. And I have to admit that I've been really disappointed so far. Now, let me caveat all that by saying, I realize it's only 100 days. There's a lot of bad policy to undo. There's a lot of good people who are doing good things to try and reverse some of this work. And so as many in the administration keep telling us, we need to be patient. But since this is sort of a report card, a midterm check-in, as it were, I think it's important to be honest about the disappointment that we're seeing. And I think there's two primary places where I've been disappointed and where I think the administration has missed easy opportunities for crafting not only clear messages, but also taking swift action to demonstrate its commitment to responsible arms transfers, human rights, and civilian protection. First, the administration has really not adequately implemented the stated approach that I mentioned at the beginning with regards to arms sales. And I know we have not yet seen a revised conventional arms transfer policy, and that could change sort of the guiding principles that the administration uses. But we've seen sort of a willingness to move ahead with some harmful sales that will likely continue to represent repressive actions by certain recipients and further human suffering. And the Biden administration has also confused its messaging about the risk of certain arms transfers by advancing responsible gun reform at home in the United States, but maintaining the ability to more easily send those same guns abroad. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there as well. The second area of concern for me is really that the administration has so far failed to demonstrate its commitment globally to human rights, harm mitigation, and responsibility in the arms trade. And this is particularly disappointing for me, given that doing so could offer easy and early wins in the administration's goal of returning to multilateralism, renewing American leadership on the world stage, and demonstrating its commitment to these conventional arms issues. So first, the US has been deafeningly silent on the Arms Trade Treaty, which had its preparatory and working group meetings last week. The ATT is the first globally or legally binding treaty to regulate the international arms trade. This was something the United States was very active in negotiating. It ensured that it was consistent with US law and met all of the US interests. And President Biden could very easily publicly or even privately reaffirm the US's commitment to the treaty, which the Trump administration undid. The US signed this treaty in 2013. But it has remained silent. It allowed last week's meeting to go without any comment, without any action. And instead, we've seen China stepping up to fill the vacuum left by US abdication of its leadership role. I think the United States has also doubled down on its commitment to have a unilateral interpretation of the missile technology control regime and continue President Trump's drone export policy. Both of these decisions could undermine the integrity of both the regime and the ability to better control the proliferation of lethal drone technology around the world. And finally, in terms of multilateralism, the United States has sent mixed signals with regard to better aligning the United States with the global consensus against the production, transfer, and use of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions. Again, easy for the Biden administration to reverse the Trump administration's policies, say it's conducting its own review, and will release its own policy shortly. There are a couple of bright spots. I'm going to leave most of those to Annie and Akbar to talk about the commitment to not selling weapons to the UAE and Saudi Arabia that were brokered during the Trump administration. There has been great rhetoric about the United States ending American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including particular arms sales. We've seen some mixed messages, some sales going through. I love that human rights is front and center in the rhetoric that the Biden administration is putting out. This is a welcome signal. This demonstrates the commitment of the administration to these principles. But as I said, in practice, the administration is often falling short. So what I'd like to see is really the actions and the decisions and the policies really match the rhetoric that we've heard so far. And let me just conclude by saying I'm really encouraged by some of the recent nominations that we've seen leading the State Department, for example. I think the administration is really aiming to put in place good people who are committed to promoting human rights and mitigating harm, and who will hopefully be able to, in the not so distant future, translate Biden's words into action. So maybe, I know that was a lot of information, but I'll stop there and turn it over to Frank.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Yes, lots of good thoughts there. And thank you for keeping these kind of short at the beginning so we have lots of Q&A, and it's tough to pack all this in. Frank, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jeff, for the kind invitation. I hope you hear me well. And hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you, Rachel, for that excellent analysis. And I must say what's left there for me to say. But I'll try and do my best to add a few more views from my side as a European, from a non-American perspective. Starting on a positive note, I think already within a few months, it's the whole change in leadership style could be starker after what I believe was very surreal and often scary stuff that we saw over the past 4 years. And so clearly the end of that highly divisive governing style is already a huge relief after 100 days. And indeed, I believe we've seen some hopeful changes in the area of foreign policy, where the return to multilateralism, including with regards to climate change and the return to the Paris Agreement, signs of getting back to the Iran deal, I think is very hopeful. And also that revival of the Iran deal and the arms export control review processes with regards to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates may indeed have contributed to what looks like a potentially significant change also in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so similarly, more diplomacy and less confrontation would also be very helpful, I believe, in relations with Russia and China. Well, I don't see that much of more approachment between the US and China and Russia so much so far. And to what extent Biden will mean real change of action when it comes to the arms trade, I must say I have some doubts, and I'll just mention a few points here. Starting with military spending, you may have seen 2 weeks ago, CIPRI released their latest military spending data, and clearly the US still holds the big lead in terms of military spending, with its 39% share of global military spending, more than the following 9 biggest countries together. And quoting a tweet that I saw from the UN disarmament chief, Ms. Nakamitsu, last week, where she referred to these data, she wrote, "Let's reimagine security, restrain military spending to respond to most pressing challenges, including climate change, COVID-19 recovery, and sustainable development. Diplomacy and disarmament are tools for our security." And I wish I would see a bit more of that spirit reflected also in US military spending changes. And also I believe from my perspective, it's quite concerning to see that your new Secretary of Defense comes straight from the board of directors of Raytheon, one of the largest arms producers in the world. And I think with the prospect of sort of stable military spending, at least for the next fiscal year, there's not much of any reason for the US arms industry to fear any major immediate cuts in domestic procurement. And interesting, it's a dossier that I've been following because the Netherlands is also involved, is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, where last couple of months there's been quite some rumors about cuts to the program that have been predicted for quite some time, but look more serious now, which would put that whole business model that was the basis of the Joint Strike Fighter project, and that was used to attract partner countries to very early on in the process participate in the development and production of the F-35. If indeed the Pentagon would decide to cut down so strongly on the F-35, that would of course mean even higher prices on top of already large increases in the cost of the F-35 over the past 2 decades. Thirdly, in terms of arms exports, any change that I've seen in export policy so far appears largely cosmetic. To my best understanding, just a few transfers of the aircraft bombs to Saudi Arabia are currently being expected to fall out of the deals that were already approved under Trump. And so other than that, to me so far, unfortunately, it looks very much like business as usual with, as I understood over the weekend, US officials flying to the Emirates to further discuss the F-35 deal with the Emirates, as well as the sale of Reaper drones. And what I understood, the main concern currently is not so much potential use of the F-35 in, for example, Yemen or Libya by the United Arab Emirates, but the fear that the UAE would compromise classified details to China. That was apparently the largest concern at the moment. And so also in this respect, I'm very curious to see where the lawsuit will go that the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs has filed. We've seen some promising litigation efforts here in Europe over the past years. Clearly very much an uphill struggle, even more so, of course, if the stakes are higher, as is the case here. But yeah, I think this is very interesting to see. Finally, if you look at this from a longer term global perspective, I've tried to compare some of the CIPRI data from the last few decades. There's actually very little evidence to suggest that Democrat-led administrations are really much more restrictive than their Republican counterparts. If you look at CIPRI data, you will see, for example, that at no point since the mid-1970s, US dominance in the arms trade was bigger than during the Clinton administration over much of the 1990s, when the US had a nearly 50% market share. And you also see that under Bush Jr. and Obama, they had sort of, under their administration, there was a comparable market share of about 30%. And so clearly we've seen under Trump, the push to export more weapons was really big, and it grew again. But I mean, altogether, it's quite a mixed bag. You can't really say that historically democratic governments have been more reluctant, more restrained with regards to arms exports. So in conclusion, not very enthusiastic about what the Biden administration has done so far in terms of the arms trade. But as Rachel, of course, also said, too early to tell, maybe, but clearly huge potential for improvement. More importantly, more important than ever, I would say, a need for civil society to continue putting pressure on the US government to exercise a much more restrictive arms export policy and reinforcing each other's work in these areas on both sides of the Atlantic. And working together with people living in countries affected by conflict remains more important than ever. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Frank. Lots of thoughts there too. Rachel, I know you and both Frank have been paying attention to the ATT meetings last week. As Frank was doing towards the end, he was putting this in the sort of the international dimensions. And I'm wondering if either of you have impressions of how other countries are seeing the United States, or what your feel is at this point in the administration. And Rachel, if you have anything that Frank said you wanted to reply to, or Frank, something that Rachel said, let's open it up now. But I'm curious, you know, you were both talking about other countries as well in this, and I wonder how you're perceiving the US, as well as what you would like to see the US doing in terms of its relations to some other countries in particular. Rachel, if I could start with you. That was a bit of a nebulous question, but there really is this sort of the perception and feel for the U.S.
Sure. Well, you know, once the Biden administration was elected, and certainly once it took office, I certainly heard from a lot of my colleagues in governments in countries around the world, asking sort of my thoughts on if I anticipated a major shift on a whole variety of issues related to the conventional arms trade. And one of them, of course, was, and we'll see the United States re-engage with the ATT now, right? Because Biden was vice president when the treaty was signed, and it's in the Democratic Party platform, and it's consistent with the messaging on multilateralism and responsible arms sales. And so I think the silence has really been shocking to many of those foreign governments. And I had quite a few emails last week because the meetings got a little surreal in a sense, where China was asserting itself as a responsible actor in the global arms trade and calling out the United States for sitting silently, on the Zoom link and not participating or making a statement or speaking out in support of the treaty. We've heard absolutely nothing from this administration. And what we know in terms of internal conversations are that there isn't going to be any action on the ATT. And I think it's really disappointing to many governments who were horrified by the Trump administration's position on the ATT and undermining sort of years of good faith negotiations with the United States and allowing things to be put in the treaty that were very much focused on the US experience and US political priorities. And to see the US walk away has been really challenging for those governments who really believed in the ATT. So I think there is a lot of disappointment on those issues. I think on the MTCR decision, there was a lot of annoyance, again, that the US is exerting an exceptionalism in terms of allowing its own unilateral interpretation of particular arms trade provisions. And we can, people can debate whether or not that decision is a good decision or a bad decision, but the rest of the world doesn't want to do it. So for the United States to say, well, we're going to do it anyway, is really, a thumb in the face of a lot of governments that are trying to find ways to work with the United States. So I would like to see that commitment to re-engagement, that commitment to multilateralism, that commitment to exerting a leadership role that the United States, I think, is responsible for. If you are the world's largest exporter, if people are looking to you to set a standard, that standard should be at the highest level, not at the sort of lowest common denominator. So I do think, in terms of your question, Jeff, about international perspectives, I think there's still a wait and see approach, but I think just like me, people are getting a little impatient. There is a lot to undo, but some of these are literally a stroke of a pen, a letter, a public statement. It's really not requiring a full-fledged revamp of policy in points A, B, and C, but sending a signal that there is a willingness to revise what the last administration had done.
Do you want to jump in, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, mainly echoing what Rachel said. Indeed, I mean, if you remember back when the Trump administration unsigned from the arms trade treaty, it was the very same weekend that China announced its intention to join the arms trade treaty as soon as possible, and they did so within a year time. They joined. And over the past 2 years, you've seen them very actively involved in all the discussions. And indeed, the contrast with the absence of the US voice in that is very stark. And yeah, I can't see what the big barrier is for Washington to join. And as Rachel said, I think all the concerns that could have been there, they've been addressed, and there's no reason at all for Biden to join at the earliest possible convenience.
Frank, I'll have one last question in this round before we go to Congress. I know in Europe, there's not unanimity in terms of providing arms to Saudi Arabia or the conflict in Yemen. There's a great bit of diversity within the continent, but there are certainly a number of countries who have stopped doing so or have stopped in certain ways. How closely do you feel Europe is looking for signals from the United States? So if the United States is doing this review. It seems to be that the review is only going to halt a little bit, not a lot. But how much do you think that matters to Europe's plans, especially given your sort of your bigger picture that the Republicans and Democrats have kind of been similar, at least from a European perspective, over the last few decades?
Clearly, I mean, any major change in the U.S. policy will affect how European decision makers will act. I'm sure about that, and so the opposite, I think, has also been true with the Trump administration. So much pushing on the arms transfers. There was indeed a drive for British and French governments, especially to push even harder to get their share of these arms deals as well. So anything to the reverse would positively influence Europe, I'm quite sure. And I mean, we've seen that with especially some of the smaller European countries who over time made some changes to their export policy, either as a full stop to arms exports to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. That had not a snowball effect, but it had effect to other countries. And so, I'm sure that any change in the US policy will really make a difference.
Great, thanks, Rachel and Frank. I saw Rachel nodding her head there. I think I have the same impression you do, Frank, about Europe, but I don't live there, so it's great to get those perspectives. I want to thank Rachel and Frank. We'll turn off their videos for a couple minutes while we go to the congressional panel, and then I'll invite Akbar and Annie to turn on their videos. And I'll also encourage everyone to please put questions, Q&A in the Q&A section there. Sam Perlow-Freeman put one in there. I'm looking specifically at the Saudi issues. He's based in the UK as well, so he has a feel for that too. But I'd now like to turn it over to see what Congress has done. Congress is not in its 100 days, maybe it's 120, got started a little bit before the Biden administration did. But as we know, was super active in the previous administration and is starting to be active in this one. I wanted to get a feel for what people are seeing. So let me quickly introduce Annie Sheelan, Akbar, Shahid, Ahmed, who I probably mispronounced slightly there, but he'll help me out. Annie Sheelan is a senior advisor for the U.S. Policy and Advocacy with the Center for Civilians in Conflict, CIVIC, the U.S. program, where she conducts research and advocacy around civilian harm. She also spent a number of years in the State Department, so has some perspectives as well from sort of the challenges in terms of decision making there. I failed to mention, I think, at the start that CIVIC and Stimson and PAX are all co-sponsors of this event, so I want to thank them as well. Akbar Shahid Ahmed is HuffPost Senior Foreign Affairs reporter based here in Washington, D.C. He helped break some of the recent stories around the UAE arms sales, but he's been reporting from the Muslim world, Europe, and elsewhere for quite a while. And just a couple of years ago, very interestingly, became the first ever Pakistani journalist to secure press credential to report from Israel and Palestine. A lot of what he looks at, I think, is the Middle East, but not exclusively, but he'll have some great insights as well. So I think maybe I'll start turning it over to you, Annie, to give a feel for what you're seeing, and then turn it over to Akbar, and we'll do a little conversation, and then invite everybody else back in.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. So I want to start with kind of what we've seen from Congress so far, and then talk very briefly about what I'm hoping to see as we move forward. So I'm actually going to start with last Congress, because I think we saw some really important signals from Congress even before Biden took office. The first thing we saw is the proliferation of legislation focused on strengthening human rights protections for arms transfers. So these included the Stop Arming Human Rights Abusers Act, introduced by Representative Omar, the Safeguard Act, introduced by Senators Menendez, Leahy, and Kaine, and the Values in Arms Export Act of 2020, introduced by Senator Murray. So all of these took slightly different approaches, from restricting arms sales based on human rights records to the creation of new oversight bodies, to address what lawmakers are increasingly recognizing as two key challenges. The first being that the US weapons continue to fuel conflict, human rights abuses, and civilian harm around the world. And the second being that Congress can't trust the current system to make the right choices and stop that from happening. So that's the first thing. The second thing we saw that I think is also really instructive is Congress's response to the Trump administration's planned sales of the $23 billion in weapons to the UAE that were discussed earlier. So this past December, the Senate took up multiple joint resolutions of disapproval against the sales, which ultimately failed to pass. However, I think it's really useful to note that members voted almost perfectly along party lines, which means that the majority of Senate Democrats were against the sales. That's important because it means that the Biden administration's recent decision to allow those controversial sales to move forward actually betrays the will of the majority of senators in his party. Moving to what we've seen so far this Congress, I think even this early and with so much going on in other policy areas, we have seen some important movement on arms sales. So most of it has been focused on the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So we saw, for example, a letter from a number of House Democrats urging Secretary of State Blinken to freeze the delivery of offensive sales to Saudi Arabia, a pause that President Biden did announce a week later, albeit, as we've seen, temporarily for the most part. Just a couple of weeks ago, we also saw the passage in the House of Representatives of, in the House of Representative Connolly's Protection of Saudi Dissidents Act, which would limit arms exports to Saudi Arabia, among other measures aimed at holding the kingdom accountable for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And then we also recently saw a bill from Senators Menendez and Feinstein called the Secure F-35 Export Act, which is at least in part a response to the planned sale of F-35s to the UAE. That bill is really focused mostly on this idea of maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge, but it does include a provision restricting the sale of F-35s to countries that have committed or enabled human rights abuses. In terms of more systematic reforms, just this past Friday, we actually saw the reintroduction of the Safeguard Act in the Senate with an expanded group of co-sponsors. So including Senators Menendez, Kaine, and Leahy, who introduced it last year, but joined now by Senators Coons, Feinstein, Murray, and Schatz. The Safeguard Act would fill a number of really important gaps. There's a lot in the bill, but I'll note a few important things, including prohibiting arms sales to countries committing war crimes, genocide, and violations of IHL, international humanitarian law. It would actually amend the Leahy law to explicitly include arms transfers, thereby prohibiting the transfer of US arms to security forces that have committed gross violations of human rights. It would require end-use monitoring to look at violations of human rights in IHL, which it does not currently do. And it would increase congressional oversight over arms transfers to countries that have been involved in certain human rights abuses and IHL violations. So that's everything we've seen so far, actually quite a bit in a short period of time, which is promising. The question as to what I'm looking at for the rest of the year, I'm going to leave most of the analysis of the politics of the issue to Akbar, but in terms of what I'm looking for policy-wise, definitely really excited to see where the Safeguard Act goes. Again, that would fill a number of really huge gaps, and so really hoping that members of Congress support it, and also, of course, really curious to see what comes out in the House, curious to see whether Representative Omar reintroduces her bill. And then the other really big thing that I'm hoping to see is I really hope to see members of Congress seize this moment to fundamentally transform the role of Congress in the arms transfer process. So with all the really important attention we see now on arms transfers, on war powers, I think it's also important to remember that arms transfers are actually the most common way through which the US involved itself in war. And I think that members of Congress and the American people have seen that there are far too few checks on the system as it stands, especially when it comes to the role of US weapons in fueling conflict, human rights abuses, and civilian harm. So what I'm watching for is legislation that, quote, flips the script by actually requiring Congress to vote affirmatively to approve certain risky sales, rather than the current system, which allows sales to move forward in the absence of overwhelming congressional disapproval, which is just far too high a bar as we've seen in the past. And that is actually an idea that we owe to then Senator Joe Biden, who first introduced it in 1986. So I'm also hoping that he is on board with the idea. That was a lot of information. I will leave it there, but really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Annie. Akbar, and tell me how badly I pronounce your name when you get started, but love your insights here.
Absolutely. Not that bad, Jeff, so not to worry. Thank you, Annie, for that excellent landscape, and thank you everyone for joining. So yeah, I've covered Congress quite closely and sort of Congress's role in these arms sales and particularly Middle East policy. I'll sort of break down what I'm seeing in 3 big points. The first is just around how intense and how much further there is still around this. So reporting out the UAE deal news, just talking to congressional sources, State Department officials, that sort of thing, you really understand that this is somewhere where the administration knows there's a lot of scrutiny and there's a lot of power with Congress on the Hill. In the first 100 days of the Biden administration, this is now one of the most striking divisions between him and his allies on the Hill. You don't see this with domestic issues in the same way. And you certainly don't see this the way it was in the Obama era, where weapons sales were brought up frequently, but you never had anywhere near, as Annie pointed out, almost all Senate Democrats voting in one particular way against these sales. I think given the Hill's track record now, particularly under Trump, of pushing firmly and successfully on restricting sales, not just on the Gulf, but also on Turkey, an important measure, and Biden's own stated commitment to prioritizing human rights, to reassessing America's leadership role, to figuring out how the US should be involved in these conflicts. There's a lot that Congress can do if they want to. The appetite to pressure Biden remains really high because there was all this talk, particularly during the primary, of a more progressive foreign policy, a Democratic administration that, to Frank's point, really does actually break with this bipartisan support of militarism. And I think we're going to see lawmakers, whether it's Congresswoman Omar, we're going to see senators who are really pushing in that direction. And the White House knows it. There was a scoop actually last week from Axios about Jake Sullivan meeting with extremely skeptical lawmakers of Biden's Yemen policy. My second point is to say, if you want to know how Congress will hold Biden accountable on arms shipments, follow the piece of legislation that Annie outlined and look at two other important factors. The first is whether lawmakers and advocates, particularly human rights advocates, but also broader progressives, people on the left in the Democratic Party, talk about militarism not as a presidential issue, but about a longstanding bipartisan agreement in US foreign policy under President Donald Trump, a character who was very easy to caricature. You could really easily sort of talk about arms deals and US foreign policy going in the wrong direction. I'm curious to see if you see that with people who have the veneer of Washington establishment, language, track records, and that sort of thing. And second, we really need to follow the conversation about US re-entry to the Iran nuclear deal. That's important because we saw President Obama, for instance, approve a record number of sales to the Saudis, the Iranians' main regional rival. People who want continued weapons transfers will say, if you're doing this, you've got to also have all these deals, whether it's to the UAE, it's to Saudi, it could also be to Egypt and other kind of concerning regimes in the region. Given that there's this kind of continued skepticism, I think we should watch if unlikely figures, Senator Menendez is a great example, someone who's skeptical of the Iran deal, but also extremely skeptical of these weapons sales. David Schenker, someone who just served in the Trump administration and helped craft these deals and a very tough position on Iran, just published a piece last week talking about the UAE sale as being concerning because of the UAE's relationship with China. And something to note with that is, we saw with the vote that Annie mentioned, Senators Mark Kelly and Kristen Sinema voting, away from the rest of the Democratic caucus. There's a lot of people who are still wild cards, not just those two senators. The two new senators from Georgia are important to watch, and there's a bunch of Republicans whose views we don't know. This is not the Republican Party of Bob Corker. Who are these people? And what do they think on these issues? And finally, I just say on media coverage, I think everyone here has done a really good job of talking about how US culpability in human rights violations, international crises, civilian suffering really isn't just about US personnel or US missions. And I think that's something that media coverage often misses. So if we talk about America's global posture, I'm hoping that a lot more of the conversation, a lot more of the coverage will address that actually this is really a matter of American weapons, intelligence, and other extremely advanced support. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Akbar. I want to maybe pick up at the point you were making towards the end and see if Annie has a comment on it as well, which is that, if I paraphrase and got it right, the impact of these weapons might really be on people's lives, and that is part that's often hard to get into the media. Is that kind of a way to rephrase that? And Annie, I mean, obviously that's what Civic is, one of its missions is to really help address civilian harm. But when you were talking about the F-35 Act, you talked about it really being about Israel's QME. I mean, how do you see the congressional conversation? I think Akbar was talking about this as well, as about those types of issues, about the civilian harm, as opposed to sort of the more hard security and I think that also gets to kind of some of the things Akbar is questioning about. We don't quite know where some people are, and then Akbar, if you have any thoughts on what Annie said, that's great too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Akbar's point was really important that, it was easy for Democratic members of Congress to push back against President Trump, right? Against his arms sales, against the way that he framed the economic benefits, particularly, in the wake of the killing of Khashoggi and, in, the harm that we see in Yemen. But of course, arms, we're talking about deadly weapons that harm people all over the world, right? It's an issue that we've seen really starkly in Yemen, but happens everywhere. And so I think one of the big questions, of course, is going to be, will this energy continue to be sustained when it comes to pushing back against President Biden and his arms sales, especially when the president and Congress are trying to work together on so many other issues? I'm hopeful that that will be the case, given that we have seen some oversight and continued legislation even during the Biden administration. But I do think that's a place where we can't take progress for granted, and there will need to be sustained pressure both on the administration and also on Congress. The other thing I want to touch on that I think is really, really important is the point that Akbar made at the end about the role of arms sales as part of this broader security framework. And I think it's really important, especially as President Biden makes good on a promise to, quote, end endless war, which I think is really important to emphasize is not just about troop withdrawal, right? That is a big point. But that's really what he's been focused on. And it's not just about troop withdrawal, right? Our forever wars are characterized not just by troop presence, but by drone strikes, by security assistance around the world, including with human rights abusers, by arms sales, right? So this whole framework that supports these forever wars could stay in place absent continued focus on those issues as well. And I think actually there's a good chance those things will increase, right? If the US withdraws troops, which is the most visible piece of that framework to most Americans, it is very likely, and I think we've seen signs of this already, that the Biden administration will say, okay, to make up for that, we actually need to do more security assistance with partners. We need to send more weapons abroad. And that does not actually make us or anyone else safer. And I think that's a really important point for us to keep emphasizing when we have this conversation about forever wars.
Akbar, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll hone in on one specific example that I think summed this up quite well last year. There was a drone strike in January 2020 that killed a number of Libyan cadets. This was very quickly connected to the ongoing UAE intervention in Libya. And it was something independent reports said, oh, this is something the UAE has done. The Trump administration didn't want to talk about this, right? Congressional staff, however, get their own briefings and have their own intelligence relationships. And as the conversation about the UAE buying on drones, in addition to the F-35s, picked up, you heard a ton of outrage on the Hill. So I think that's one of the lasting legacies too of the Trump era is you're not going to have lawmakers and congressional staff wait for state DOD and everyone else, particularly in administration that they're skeptical of, to come and tell them what's happening and what the full consequences of these deals are. Again, the way that the GRDs happened, the way that an earlier Trump administration sale, if you remember, under the emergency powers to the Saudis happened, there's just been such a kind of destruction of the normal procedure of Congress being informed about these transfers. I think you're going to just see heightened scrutiny, particularly from people who've been working on these issues for years and in some cases decades, right? Why would they continue to just take what they're told without doing their own investigations?
That's sort of a funny question for both of you, but we should note that the UAE deal, the administration is saying, hey, there's still a lot to be worked out, right? Where this is going to be years in the future, so on and so forth. And on the Saudis piece of it, we really don't have great intel, at least publicly, about what's going on. But obviously, many members of Congress, Gregory Meeks, the House Foreign Affairs Committee is saying there's concerns and there's time to work on the UAE deals. I think what you're seeing Menendez doing is talking about the conditions that need to be put on these sales. As you look at this Congress moving forward, are you expecting a lot more of that conditionality, that signaling of conditions that need to be put on sales? And maybe that will be a way that, if some of the things in the Safeguards Act that Annie's talking about, it would be almost impossible for countries to actually meet those measures. Do we expect that to be maybe the crafty way that we see Congress moving forward? Is, okay, this isn't finalized, we're going to put some conditions on here, and those conditions will be tough enough. And maybe they won't say it so publicly because they don't want to, you know, they are of the same party in many cases, but maybe this will be a backdoor way.
Just in terms of, so like the Safeguard Act, for example, in terms of the conditions that puts on the administration?
Yeah, I mean, whether the congressional action may not be always critical of Biden, but instead towards conditionality that may functionally accomplish the same thing, but avoid the political back and forth.
I mean, I think it's not just, I don't know how much it's about the political back and forth, but I think it's also just, we're in this unique moment where we actually might have an opportunity for more structural change, right? It is not great for the administration or for Congress, regardless of the administration, to keep going back and forth on, you know, bans for specific countries, right? For Congress to have to do something every single time there's a sale that they don't like. Again, I do think that we need more congressional oversight and changes those procedures that do require Congress to have oversight over those sales, the flip the script idea that I mentioned. But on the side of the administration, it is far preferable to not just keep taking action on specific sales, but to fundamentally reform and add additional requirements on, excuse me, on the administration, you know, in terms of the conditions that need to be taken into account. And that's really important because those changes, both to congressional procedure, but also to requirements on the executive branch, last beyond a single administration, right? Those, if they're put into law, last, you know, whoever replaces Biden. So yeah, it might be a matter of politics, but I think it's also the best option to make those structural changes. I hope you're right that it's politically easier. I'm not convinced, but I think that this is the moment to do it. And I think this is a moment that we have not had in the past few decades.
Just on that sort of link between this conditions conversation and the politics, I just think the genie's out of the bottle in a way on arms sales that lawmakers really haven't caught up to. Like, they've made this a populist issue, right? And that's not going to stop. So actually having these kind of, whether it's backroom agreements or sort of conversations that are like, well, now we have faith, you know, as chairman of X, Y, and Z committee. No, you now have activists, right? And you see this on Yemen is a great example. There's just continued outrage and furor on Biden's Yemen policy, even though some important lawmakers have said, okay, we want to work with you on this. You see activists, and particularly Democratic Party base, saying, we're not giving this up. This was a promise you made to us. And I think with people having felt success, like success is often a driver of, oh, I'm going to keep going. And with people having felt success on pushing on Yemen, on pushing on getting aerial refueling done, and then feeling intense disappointment, as you did on MBS, you know, not being sanctioned after the Khashoggi murder, the public uproar on this, I think, is going to continue fueling Biden's thinking, and we can't ignore it.
Great, thanks. Let me invite Frank and Rachel back in now and sort of open it up for the broad conversation as they are coming on. Bill Hartung has a question in here that I think is also interesting as we all come back together to think about. Obviously, the U.S. arms relationship isn't in a vacuum. There are so many other factors in any relationship with any country, and so we've talked about that some. But then there are other countries in the market of selling weapons, which are often used as a rationale for the U.S. to continue. If we don't sell it, somebody else will, which we are hearing for the UAE in particular as we talk about the Middle East, and I think that's part of Bill's question here. As we're now in the new Biden administration, have you seen him or Congress sort of addressing this issue in interesting or new ways, or how would you like to see Biden and the administration sort of tackle the other countries type questions that are often sort of inherent in as we think about the arms trade? And if when you speak, you've been sitting quietly for a while, like Frank and Rachel listening to Annie and Akbar, if you want to comment on something they said, feel free to jump in, and vice versa. Does anyone want to sort of jump in there on competition with China, Russia, or the other countries coming in? Rachel, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, look, I think you've all heard me say, just because someone else is going to do something doesn't mean that you should also. I mean, that argument always sort of bothers me to no end. But I think the real issue here is that this administration has said, right? We have the words, they have the rhetoric that they are differentiating themselves from the previous administration, that they're not going to look at short-term economic gains, that this is a rights-promoting, human rights foreign policy, that we are interested in re-exerting US leadership and responsibility in the global arms trade. And I think the rhetoric and the actions really do have to match in this point. And we can argue the finer points of some of the other recipients that perhaps civil society would like to see more caution and the administration is going forward. But I think there is no more obvious or clear-cut case than when you're talking about what's happening in Yemen. And when we know that the weapons we are providing are causing direct harm, that should be, there shouldn't even be this public debate around it. This is the easiest case to use as an example of that rights promoting framework. And so I think it is very challenging when it's yeah, but, or yes, we understand that, but also relationship with allies in the Middle East, dealing with other pressures in that region of the world. At some point, you have to say our values, our principles that align with our foreign policy and national security objectives have to be front and center here, right? Because if we don't serve as an example of how we can address some of these really complex issues, that we cannot get to what are the underlying reasons for these conflicts, that we can't work to provide solutions or alternatives to military assistance, then we can't succeed in other places, right? So we have to be able or be willing to take that first step here and to draw some very challenging lines and not do what we have seen done. I mean, Frank mentioned at the very beginning, it doesn't matter if it's a Republican or Democratic administration, and it really hasn't over the last 30 plus years since the Cold War ended, because it's really been US dominated here. And so I just would like to see this be an opportunity to revise the entire US approach to military assistance, to security sector reform, to rebalancing how the State Department, Defense Department work to develop partnerships and alliances that is not rooted simply in the provision of lethal assistance. I think there's this is a watershed moment. We're 20 years post 9/11. We're reflecting on all of these ways in which the United States has conducted business for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And if we can't start with the quote unquote obvious easy cases, I don't know how we're going to see any progress.
If I could pick up on that really quickly, just to add on to some of Rachel's later points, particularly in response, I mean, I have plenty to say on the China question, but I think Rachel really hit the nail on the head. In terms of the question about, allies needing weapons when the US leaves, I just want to push back on that too, because first of all, weapons sales are transactional foreign policy, right? They don't build long-term relationships, and they also don't build capacity. And I think, as Rachel mentioned, if we're really looking at a shift of foreign policy that prioritizes human rights, that prioritizes diplomacy and multilateralism, and hopefully leaves this forever war framework behind, then focusing on US weapons as foreign policy doesn't make any sense, right? What we should be providing to those partners is diplomatic support, peace building support, humanitarian aid, right? How do we make people safer in that country while they work towards peace? I'll also just note, I think, on the point about, how Saudi Arabia has used US weapons, for example, the US has had an advising mission in Saudi Arabia, that was presumably meant to help reduce civilian harm and mitigate civilian harm while the US was providing weapons. That mission continued while civilians continued to be killed in Yemen, while there continued to be alleged violations of IHL. That advising continued and was happening, I believe, during the strike on a school bus. So I would say that that was not worth it and didn't work in the end. And that it does not make sense to say, you know, we're going to keep doing other capacity building so that they know how to use these weapons well, when those weapons are causing incredible destruction, excuse me.
Frank or Akbar, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead. You go ahead.
Just quickly on this is just such an old argument, right? And it's not just an argument that's heard here, but it's very much an argument that emanates from foreign capitals. And looking at the history, it's remarkable that it keeps getting tried out all the time, given that, you know, you've seen these countries build up their weapon systems based on US support, so they can't really move very quickly, which, like, has been mentioned in the chat, and I think is a really good point. And that, you know, it's a flip to say that the US's goal is just to continue selling weapons and therefore that's it, right? You saw this with, for instance, Bush on Israel-Palestine. Bush said, I'm not giving you loan guarantees because I want you to advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. And that's what he did. He had a goal in mind. I think for other governments and for people who are framing this very much in the US will lose out, there's a real reframe that needs to happen, which is what does the US actually get and want to achieve? And you see this with governments. I mentioned Turkey earlier. The governments will say, we'll go to Russia. Ultimately, Turkey lost the F-35 because they went to Russia, right? So like the US can also have its own priorities and say, well, we don't want you buying the S-400.
Yeah, what I wanted to say, indeed, if that's your main concern, then you rather don't need an arms export policy, really. I mean, you have an arms export policy because you're concerned about potential human rights abuses or violations of international law. And indeed, I think as I understand from the chat as well, that also it's not so easily to switch to other systems. And for example, Saudi Arabia has had experience with Chinese armed drones that they bought. These experiences weren't so good as I understood it. And also what you refer to, Akbar, is with the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which was applied to Turkey. I'm actually curious because that has been possibly the only really thing that mattered in terms of arms export policy under Trump, to what extent Biden would continue that and apply to, for example, India, which is at the moment buying exactly the same air defense systems that Turkey was buying. And since India may be interested in buying F-35 aircraft at some point as well, how will the US apply this act to India, and to the same extent to Egypt, that currently has F-16s, may at some point also buy F-35s. So and yeah, that would be interested to hear insights from colleagues on that as well.
Anybody want to take up Frank's question? I'll just note a little bit, Frank, that many people may realize that on Friday, the Biden administration notified almost $2.5 billion worth of arms sales to India, but they weren't this weapon system that was controversial, right? Because Menendez, or a couple months ago, flagged these cats of concerns. I think what's really interesting in the U.S. law is that there are provisions that impact the arms trade in many different ways. So, you know, the Israeli QME is impacting what happens in the Middle East, even if not everyone on this, all our panelists love that provision, that exists. This CATSA sanction, I think, is one of the new ones also that has really had a huge impact on these relations. You mentioned Turkey, but I think it is going to impact India and some others. And then obviously you have the old relatively, the Leahy law, which has been really impactful. I think is still seen around the world as a super important American commitment. And this is one of the pieces I think we're talking about. How do we actually make that implementation apply to arms sales rather than just assistance? I do think there are pieces of U.S. law that, if expanded or just implemented, would make a big difference. And I do see those happen. I do see that happen in ways. There's lots of anti-corruption legislation also, which I think can be relevant here as well. Does anybody else want to? I'm tempted to go a number of different ways. The Q&A, I feel like we've tackled, although I haven't marked them as answered. I feel like we've touched around those issues. But if there's anybody who wants to look at those 3 Q&As and pick up on a point you think we've missed, or if anybody in the audience wants to add in some more Q&As, that would be great. Anybody want to jump there before I maybe ask a different question? Okay. Curious here, because we have so many people on this call, to talk about drones a little bit, because this is sort of key in the UAE arms sale. They're not. I think they've been renamed from Reapers to something else at this point. But that sale, Rachel has talked about the MTCR. Annie obviously talking about American military use of drones around the world. If someone wants to comment on sort of what they think U.S. approach to, Rachel just had a report out on this last week, so maybe she wants to start off on this. But how we think about this part of the arms trade, because I think what's interesting is the arms trade isn't a monolith, and there's different weapon systems, and some countries are more able to sell certain systems than others, which sort of makes this the big picture numbers you have to dig into in some ways. But I wonder how what you'd like to see on drones, or if others have comments on drones on this. And feel free again to comment on something someone else has said.
Since you teed me up so nicely, Jeff, I'll go first. I think, look, with drones, I think we have to be very careful to separate out drones from other weapon systems. It's what is the system allowing you to do? That's why the report we launched last week was not solely about drones, right? It was about the lethal use of force and the decisions that states make in terms of using lethal systems to carry out particular operations. Drones have particular attributes which make them very attractive to using them in areas where we don't want troops on the ground, where we want loitering capabilities, where we want to have very targeted strikes against particular targets, right? There's all sorts of reasons why you would use this technology. The truth is that to have a network of UAVs that are utilized by a government is very expensive. It requires a massive command and control apparatus. But if you were only concerned about simply launching an attack and you don't care about getting that system back, you're not trying to gather intelligence, right? Then you don't need a very sophisticated drone to be able to deliver some kind of payload and have the destructive force that you're interested in achieving. So we do need to separate a little bit the difference between sort of the more sophisticated command and control systems that go along with deploying a network of armed drones. That's very different than, say, if we're talking about commercial exports, which is one of the things you hear administrations talk about, which is, these are off the shelf in many cases, available technologies, and we're just adding to, trying to get into the commercial market, and you can, the U.S. has to be competitive. The reality is that many other countries are leading the way in terms of armed drones use. The U.S. is trying to get back some of the market share that it had lost under following a particularly strict policy, which allows a case-by-case review of these systems and has a presumption of denial, which is not a no. It just means get us to yes before yes becomes no. It's just, a different way of thinking about how you control particular exports. But I do think that we need to think about, in all of these, whether we're talking about arms sales to Saudi Arabia or using drones as an alternative to having troops on the ground in Afghanistan, it's all about how are we projecting and using force around the world. And that's where sort of the rhetoric in terms of human rights coming first and looking at ways to mitigate civilian harm, that's where those come to the forefront. So it's not specific, I think, to drones and drones exports. And I would hope that as the Biden administration is undertaking a larger review around its conventional arms transfer policy, that it's putting sort of the new realities of conflict, of tensions in the world, of ways in which force is being used. Those are the issues that are at the fore, not sort of the as Annie mentioned, the transactional approach, or what are we getting in the short term, but really the long-term impacts of these transfers, not only on the people, but also on the relationships that we're trying to develop, and the partnerships and alliances that we're trying to create.
Anyone else want to jump in on this? Okay. No, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I mean, just on the drones, and I think, as I understand Rachel rightly, that what would actually be good here is to draw lessons from the experience that we've had since over the past 20 years, basically, where the US was doing most of these drones operations. And if you look at how that has also inspired other countries to go on a similar approach, look at, for example, Turkey, who has developed a proper armed drones industry and has been exporting these armed drones as well, and has been using them in Libya, for example, has exported them to Ukraine and to Azerbaijan, where they've been used in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh recently. I think these are sort of developments that should worry the US administration as well, and maybe serve as a stimulus for them to start discussing these issues on an international level as well, with the aim to restrain both the exports and use of these sort of weapons, as with the aim to reduce civilian harm that we've seen so much coming from the use of armed drones over the past decades.
Yeah, I would just say it's not just the proliferation of drones that has increased over time. It's the proliferation of the use, right? So the U.S. Was just a handful of countries that would be. The U.S. is one of a handful of countries that use these systems outside of traditional battlefields, 20 years ago, and now we're seeing not only the demand increase, but we're seeing states, non-state actors utilizing the technology in ways that we probably never would have imagined 20 years ago.
I'm having trouble getting to my unmute button fast enough. Thanks, both of you, for these thoughts. There's some questions in the Q&A here. I thought maybe first I'll take Vincent Campos' question about what we'd fundamentally want to see changed in the conventional arms transfer policy. I think Rachel laid it out in sort of the big picture, but turn it over to Annie to see if she wants to jump on that, and if there's any other people who want to reply on that. And then I think I'm going to turn to Akbar to take a look at Elias's interesting question here.
Yeah, I think happy to talk about the conventional arms transfer policy, the CAT policy, which I think Rachel really laid out pretty well. So I might repeat you quite a bit, Rachel, but I think it's worth repeating, because I think that the CAT policy is, as Rachel noted, one place, one thing that we know will take a little bit of time, and one place where we are really hopeful that we can see really meaningful change in policy. First and foremost, that policy should prioritize and center human rights, IHL, civilian harm, anti-corruption in the policy, and de-emphasize industry concerns, which we saw really heavily emphasized in the Trump policy. I think that policy can also add a lot more information about the ways that decisions should be made in the State Department and the executive branch when it comes to arms transfers. So requiring risk assessments of all countries receiving US arms based on things like record of human rights abuses, corruption, diversion or misuse of weapons, all of these things that contribute to harm and human rights abuses. Also, as Rachel mentioned, that kind of presumption of denial, it shouldn't be a given that you're going to receive a weapon from the United States, okay? So we should have a strong presumption of denial in that policy, especially when it comes to risks for human rights abuses, for not just the weapon being used in violations of human rights, but also for that sale or transfer supporting impunity for human rights abuses. Those things, human rights abuses, IHL, anti-corruption, should all be included in standard terms of sale, right? Partners should have to, or recipients of US arms should have to agree, I will not use the weapon for XYZ, which also is not standard right now. And then again, that point about end use monitoring. Contrary to common belief, end use monitoring does not actually monitor the use of the weapon in terms of human rights violations, in terms of use and civilian harm and IHL violations. That will probably require a new kind of program, but that CAP policy can and should signal that end use monitoring will monitor those things and signal the kind of accountability that will happen from violations of end use monitoring, which we also don't really see. The CAP policy also has a section where you can talk about the various regimes that the US signs up for globally. The ATT should be part of that. The MTCR should be part of that. I think, again, there's a lot that needs to be changed, but I think that there's a lot of good that could happen from a really strong CAP policy, and we're really hopeful to see that in the next year. Next 6 months, I'll say.
Great, thanks, Annie. Akbar, did you want to jump in a little bit on Elias's question there? And you had a couple of comments you wanted to throw in, which would be great.
Yeah, I just thought it was a really good question, because this great power competition thing just seems to be so deeply ingrained now, and I don't think we will see that going anywhere. So I think the thing to watch on it, particularly about US-China competition and how arms importers positions themselves, is what countries like not just the UAE, but others, Egypt, Turkey, other regimes, how they position themselves, because I think there's going to be increasing pressure to say, you're with us or against us. And I think that the immediate assumption a lot of us might have is the US is just going to funnel out arms to anyone who says, we're with you against China. And I don't think it's going to be as simple or as straightforward as that. I was just also going to say on the Saudi, Sam raised the point of, are all Saudi shipments going through, and is it a done deal? I think anyone who's followed the ups and downs of kind of US-Saudi weapons transfers over the last few years, it's not a done deal. Nothing is a done deal. And I think we'll see increasing pressure on that. If, Biden's actually promised to take a few more actions on Saudi. He said this is not the extent of our response to Khashoggi. This is not the extent of our response to Yemen. If he doesn't do that in the next 3 to 6 months, I think you'll see Congress really pushing intensely for more. And then just finally, there was a question about Turkey and the F-35. Turkey certainly is still a member of NATO. Frank can maybe comment on this more, but there's increasing questions in Europe too about Turkey's role in NATO. So I don't think that necessarily you'll see people rushing to the exits to court Turkey and provide it with a 5th generation fighter. I think you'll see Turkey having to do that for itself.
If I could just add really quickly on the done deal point, because I think that's really important. Just to reiterate, right, some of these weapons we're talking about may not be delivered for quite a long time. Biden or I believe Congress can stop those sales at any time until delivery, right? The policy challenges inherent in doing that certainly increase, and so it's better to do it sooner rather than later, but those can be stopped at any time. So there is definitely opportunity to stop those sales. And I will say, I believe in both chambers, there were resolutions of disapproval reintroduced in January that didn't go anywhere because Biden had announced the pause. I'm also curious to see what will happen now that that pause turns out to be quite temporary for the most part. So we may still see action too on those.
Thanks, Annie. Frank, you may want to pass, but I have seen the European countries' relations to Turkey sometimes be a lot tougher, actually, than the United States. And I wonder if I don't know I think watching what happens with Turkey is going to be one of those things over the next 5 years. It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, this is a NATO ally who is in many ways not acting like a NATO ally. But I wonder if there's a European perspective that might help inform how we think about it in the US. If there's not, Frank, you can just punt on that one. But I will say, after Frank, I'm going to ask all the panelists as a concluding thought, and I might know you might have already answered it, but if there's one thing that at the end of this year, if we were to come back together, if you saw that one thing happen, would really change your assessment of where we are now as to where we ended up at the end of the year. So if there's one thing in particular you're looking to see what happens, even if you don't think it's overly likely, that would be a great way to wrap up here. But Frank, before we get to that, just a sense of if you have anything more on Turkey and sort of the European approach on it.
Yeah, I mean, there was quite a strong response from Europe after Turkey captured Afrin in northern Syria, Kurdish held. For example, for the Dutch government, that was the point to have a sort of informal embargo against Turkey. Not all EU countries do that. But yeah, I mean, it's clear that under Erdogan, relations both with the EU and with NATO aren't good. I can't tell whether Turkey may at some point decide to continue without NATO, or that NATO may decide that. I mean, we've seen that on the EU level, that the sort of membership that Turkey had been waiting for is so long in the fridge that it's so unlikely to happen anytime soon. But on the other hand, I don't see Turkey easily buying fifth generation fighter jets from Russia, for example, because also relations with Russia aren't really that good. And Turkey, in the meantime, is trying to develop one itself, but that will take at least 10, 15, 20 years before that's ready to fly. So yeah, I think in the meantime, they have no other choice than to wait and see, and maybe under a future president, things may change under a future Turkish president. But there's no real end in sight to Erdogan's presidency yet.
Thanks, Frank. Okay, I hope I will. Frank doesn't have to answer my closing question first, because he was the last one speaking. But I wonder if any of you would like to go first in terms of what the one thing that you might be really looking at by the end of this year that would impact your assessment of where things are. I'm going to pick Annie to go first because she's at the top corner of my screen.
Awesome. I mean, I think, right, there are a number of things that would make an enormous difference in the next year, right? A really strong cap policy would make a huge difference. Passing the Safeguard Act would make a huge difference. Flipping the script would make a huge difference. But I think my answer to your question is that I would really just like to see a fundamental, almost a cultural shift and acknowledgement by the administration and by Congress, again, that arms sales, among other things, among drone strikes, among security assistance, among troop presence, that all of those things make up this militarized approach to foreign policy. And what I would really like to see is a public grappling with that and a commitment to a different way forward, right? I think we've seen that most obviously when it comes, again, like I said, to troops, but I would really just like to see public acknowledgement that that is a framework we're operating under right now, and a commitment to a different approach.
Annie gets points for throwing many things in, which was good. But Akbar, can I call on you to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I had so many weird things, but I will pick what might be the most tangible, which would be, and this would really change my assessment, if in the next year, the two Democratic held chambers actually do have serious votes that send legislation to the president's desk where he has to make a decision on a sale. And to Annie's point earlier, you saw under the Trump administration, AUMFs get sent to him and him sort of say, I don't care. I think you could see an AUMF go to President Biden, and he may very well decide it's actually within, smart to sign it. But as we've seen in so many of these conversations, the US government defines hostilities and finds ways to work around AUMFs or barriers on its operations. So I think if you see an actual, really specific, tangible, either UAE sale, Saudi sale, Egypt, Turkey, any of these concerning regimes, people are talking about conditioning military aid to Israel. If one of those go and there's an actual Democratic Party split or shift or decision point, that would really change my thinking.
Thank you. Frank, then Rachel. I'm going to give Rachel the last word.
Okay, yeah, to me, any meaningful cut in arms transfers to especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but probably to the Middle East as a whole, I think that is part of the answer to a more peaceful Middle East. And I hope that could be one of the contributions of the Biden administration.
So there's a little pressure going last because, of course, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I think the key thing for me is that arms sales can't be looked at in isolation, right? They're part of all of these larger discussions. Those of us who do this work know that people always say, I'm not prioritizing arms sales. It's not really an issue I'm working on. Arms sales are part of all of these conversations that we're having as we're reckoning with 20 years post 9/11. It's fundamental to these conversations. And so I'd really like to see congressional assertion of their oversight and accountability responsibilities. I'd love to see the Biden administration stand up to interest groups, whether those are economic interest groups or political interest groups, and not shy away from engaging in challenging conversations. I think the cap policy is fundamental to all of this, that I really hope we see a new cap policy by the end of the year. And I hope we see, like tomorrow, the letter sent from Secretary Blinken to the UN saying the United States is rejoining the ATT and becoming part of that conversation, because it's an embarrassment, frankly. And the rest of the world is looking at it and seeing a signal that the United States really doesn't care about its multilateral commitments or putting human rights first in terms of arms sales policy. So that's not the end of the year. I'm going to push on that every single day, every forum that I get, because it literally is a piece of paper. And there are no legal impediments to doing it. It really is a political decision. So that to me is not a next year or 1 year from now or even 6 months from now. That's today. The other things, I think, as Annie said, it's a fundamental shift. It is a reckoning with policies of the last 30 years. It is going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but if we don't have that conversation now, it will be business as usual, even with people in place who want to do better and want to do the right thing, because the system just isn't equipped to deal with that fundamental change.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks all of you. I'll just echo one of the things that I think Dan Mahanty here put in the chat, which is to make the connection between what we do at home and the foreign, our approach to the world, and flag something Rachel talked about at the beginning, which was how we deal with exporting firearms. I think there's a number of these disconnects that can help the American people understand the relation between arms sales and life at home. And the Biden administration has been super strong on trying to control assault weapons, ending domestic violence, gun violence concerns the United States, while at the same time we've loosened our ability to sell these weapons, which really just, I think at a fundamental level, most Americans would get that. Why are we concerned about these weapons on our streets, but suddenly having less oversight and less transparency into how we're selling them? I think those things, if we see one of those, that'll be aligned with what many of us are talking about here. But I want to thank Annie and Akbar and Frank and Rachel for really providing your insights. We had a conversation last week about what we wanted to talk about, and we had so many things that came up that it was great to do this in live now. I want to thank everyone who has joined in as an audience member for this event. When you exit, there will be a chance for you to do a quick poll on how it went, which we would love to get your feedback. I want to thank again the co-sponsors from Civic, PAX, and the Stimson Center for doing this. Afterwards, we'll try to send a follow-up with some resources, but thank you all very much for joining in. Thank you.